So how is learning a third language different from learning a second language? Today, this is what we're going to be getting into in this video because it is very different when you are learning languages after you've already learned one. So for example, like I speak Spanish as a second language if you didn't already know, and I speak French as a third language. So I have some experience with a second language, much more than with my third. And the process for acquiring a second language and a third language is pretty different because when you acquire the first foreign language, so your second language, there's more that goes into it than just learning the language. You have to learn what language is. And if you don't know already, if you don't already have a background in linguistics, at least from my experience, when I learned Spanish, I had to learn the structure of language. I had to learn linguistics, basically. I had to learn, like, not just the basic nouns and verbs and adjectives and all of that, but how direct object pronouns work and indirect object pronouns and articles and semantics and syntax and all of that, how all of that works. And it's not to say that that's the only way to learn a second language. It's just the most common way that people learn a second language here in the United States. So that's my background with that. And then French, I started learning French a few years ago. About 4 years ago, I took classes for about a year and a half, and I've kind of taken a little break in between. So my French is pretty rusty. It's really bad, if I'm being honest. But I am studying it again now and I'm working on improving it. Because it is Spanish and French, they are similar languages, like they're both Romance languages. So that helps tremendously because I found that when I was learning Spanish, it was difficult. It was really difficult. I struggled because I did it quickly. I did my second year all in like 8 weeks. So I kind of crammed, and then I went to different schools, so I had some gaps, and so I had to fill in those on my own and work with a tutor and all of that, but I got it all together and I feel very confident about my level of Spanish now. So it took a while, and I know from that experience that the process of learning a second language is more involved than a third. Now, it's so much work to learn any language, whether it's your first or your second or your third or your 50th, whatever it is, it's going to be a lot of work to learn it because there's so much to know about the orthography and about the speech and about everything, different dialects, everything that there is to know about a language. There's so much, so we'll be getting into all that today. Any languages work, but when you're learning a second language, it's so much more because people don't realize that you have to learn how to learn a language. So that's why when you see people who speak several languages, you're like, oh man, how can you do that? I can't even learn one other language. And it's because they've learned how to learn languages. So once you learn that process, you can just apply it to other languages. And yes, it's easier if they're in the same family, like the Romance languages. So since I speak Spanish, I can learn fairly easily French and Portuguese and Italian. But if I wanted to learn something like Arabic, although it has some relation to Spanish, it's not much, and it would be much more challenging. The orthography is completely different, right? Instead of left to right, it's right to left, and the characters are different. They don't use the Roman alphabet. It's so different. Or if you were learning like Chinese or Japanese or Russian or anything else with a different alphabet, that presents a challenge all on its own because it is a part of a different language family and the orthography is different, and it would be more work to learn that. But because if you have learned a second language, you already have been through the process of learning a second language, which is that you start by learning some basics, right? Some basic vocabulary, some basic grammar, and then you start practicing it. You get comfortable with speaking in that language, which can really be a challenge depending on just your confidence and comfort level with speaking and being around other people. So you get past that, which is huge, and then just expression, you know, writing and then with reading, and you develop those skills for learning a language. Those skills all transfer when you go to learn another language. So when you go to learn your third or fourth or whatever language it is, even if it's a different language family, those skills will transfer. So now you do have to learn the other orthography and the other sounds, and like if you're learning something like a Vietnamese, you know, you have different tones, so you do have to learn that, and as a native English speaker, that will probably be very difficult for you. I haven't thoroughly studied any of these languages that I'm mentioning except for Spanish and French, and even my French is not too thorough at this point. So this is very much just an overview of these languages and some of the things that I have discovered just like in passing through these languages. So if you want to know more about a specific language that I mentioned, or you have a correction for me about one of those languages, feel free to do your own research and you can add it below in the comments and whatever you need. Anyway, so how is learning a third language different? Well, when you learn a third language, like when I started learning French, I noticed that the similarities to Spanish made it so much easier because I didn't have to learn how to conjugate verbs all over again. And yes, English verbs are conjugated, but not in the same way that Romance languages have conjugated verbs. So I learned that, and then it just transferred very easily into French, and also a lot of the vocabulary is similar, and that made it just easier overall to learn French. So, and then the pronunciation is different, so that's something that I have to work on and get comfortable making the sound. Like in Spanish, you have the trill R like rojo, and then in French, you have the more throat sounding R, like grenouille, that's like a frog. So you have that sound, which, and I chose a very difficult word to pronounce in French, so it was the only word that I could think of that had an R in it. But anyway, hopefully my pronunciation was not too terrible. So those are differences that you'll have to learn, but it is interesting that in both of those languages, the R's are really the challenging one. At least from when I was learning, I found those to be the most challenging. Because even in Spanish, like I can't really roll my R's, I can just kind of manipulate the word to make it sound like it. And then in French, it's really getting comfortable making that sound in your throat, because that's part of what makes language learning kind of difficult and uncomfortable, is getting used to making sounds that you don't normally make and knowing that you're probably gonna make them wrong, at least at first. So it's a challenge. It's a test of confidence ultimately, and just perseverance to get there. So the main difference between learning a second language and a third language is that with your second language, you're learning all of that structure of language and the language itself. And then the third language, you really can just focus on the language. So like when I started learning French, I was able to just focus on French because I already knew how verbs are conjugated, and I already knew like how to put sentences together, and I had already been through the process of learning a language. So it made it easier. It still is not easy, so I'm not saying that I'm just gonna go in and I'm gonna, I'm gonna be speaking French in a few months. No, it's gonna take me years and years and years, but it's much easier than when I started learning Spanish because I've already been through that process, and because the alphabet is the same, all of those similarities will transfer and all of the skills will transfer. And my confidence in speaking another language is there. I've already gotten past that, and it's not perfect yet, and it never will be, but I've gotten started on it at least, and I have a direction that I'm moving in, and I found techniques to study language. So I know like how I'm gonna memorize my words when I begin, and how I'm going to practice conjugating, and how I'm gonna practice my fluency and all of that. So the more languages you learn, and I say this, but keep in mind that I have only learned 2 other languages, and yeah, so as I learn more, I will share it with you guys here on my channel, but for right now, I just have those 2 languages. So when I say when you learn more languages, this is how I feel it's going to be, and how I imagine it is for people who speak more languages than that. And if you do speak more languages than that, I'll be very interested to know about your experience learning those other languages. What is your system for learning a language? Like, do you approach each language the same way? Do you have like, I'm gonna learn vocabulary and grammar, and then I'm going to learn this much before I start practicing speaking, I'm gonna do listening. Do you have a system in place, or do you kind of personalize it for each language? Or do you take classes and then just follow those classes? I'd be really interested to hear what some of you guys do, if there are any polyglots out there watching this video. So if you have something to say, feel free to add it in the comments below, and I will be checking those. I'll see you guys back here next time. Ciao!